The future of democracy is being painted in gloom. Surging populism and declining confidence in its core institutions, including independent judiciary and free press, suggest a general disillusionment with this democracy. High-profile corruption scandals, outsized corporate influence, and expanding inequality have increasingly exposed the limitations of democracy in delivering on its promise of a fair and just society. More recently, under the strain of the global pandemic, we witnessed the rapid unraveling of many of democracies' cherished features such as freedom of speech and right to protest. Societies world over witness strong centralizing tendencies, pushing for direct state control, censorship, rising state surveillance, and diminution of civil liberties. For centuries, the Western world has professed democracy as the greatest invention of mankind, the highest form of human civilization, and the most reliable mechanism for holding governments accountable. Its advocates have long contended that despite its many flaws, there is no better alternative to democracy that would ensure the rule of law and achieve lasting universal prosperity. However, now they are faced with the formidable challenge of China's unprecedented economic success, and they seem to be clueless on how to respond. People have started openly questioning the foundational pillars of democracy, such as universal franchise and free speech. Long abandoned alternative ideologies like fascism are finding new champions. Are we seeing the beginning of the end of democracy? Many experts dismiss such dreary prophecies as unnecessarily alarmist. While acknowledging the trends noted above, they point to large-scale protests in cities around the world, expansion of media, high voter turnouts, and overthrowing of incumbent governments through free and fair elections as evidence of the civil society pushing back and people demanding more democracy, not less. The many recent instances where courts have ruled against government's encroachment on people's rights shows that institutional checks and balances embedded within the democratic system remain robust. If anything, these tug of wars are likely to invigorate democracy. How does one make sense of these polar opposite views? That is what this session aims to explore. Welcome to Argumentative Indians. We are a non-partisan forum for exchange of bold ideas and informed insights on society, politics, and culture. Our goal is to revive the traditions of critical inquiry and logical reasoning. With this, we hope to resurrect facts and reason into increasingly rhetoric-dominated contemporary Indian discourse. I'm honored to be joined by four highly distinguished guests to address the topic, is democracy in decline? We have with us Dr. Sheri Berman, Professor of Political Science at Columbia University and board member of the Journal of Democracy. Dr. T.V. Paul, Professor of International Relations, McGill University, and founding director of the Global Research Network on Peaceful Change. Mr. Tony Joseph, author of The Silent Coup and A Feast of Vultures, the Hidden Business of Democracy in India, and founder of Confluence Media. Ms. Amy Slipowitz, Research Manager for Freedom in the World, Freedom House flagship annual report assessing the condition of political rights and civil liberties around the world. Welcome all of you to Argumentative Indians. So Freedom House, in its latest annual report on global political rights and liberties, downgraded India from a free democracy to a partially free democracy. What precipitated that fall? Amy, can we start with you?
Yeah, absolutely. So in 2020, a major blow to global democracy was India's drop from free to partly free. For those who aren't familiar, Freedom in the World assesses political rights and civil liberties in 210 countries and territories around the world. And this is done through a 25 indicator methodology that divides the world into free, partly free, and not free. India does continue to hold very successful elections, but we all know that democracy is about more than just elections. So the decline we saw was really driven by Prime Minister Modi's consolidation of power and his blatant prioritization of his own interests over inclusion and equal rights that the country was founded on. At the same time, the government has pursued a crackdown on expressions of dissent by the media, academics, civil society groups, and protesters. Putting it into the global context, last week, Freedom House released our latest edition of Freedom in the World, which covers calendar year 2021. And based on that analysis, we found that global democracy continues to face a dire threat. So 2021 marked the 16th consecutive year of global decline. What I mean by this is that 60 countries suffered declines in freedom of democracy over the past year, and only 25 countries improved. And this is actually the fewest number of net improvements since the decline began. So this small number of improvements to us is a sign that the decline is not reversing and is in fact deepening. One of the key drivers of this is that autocrats are increasingly cooperating and supporting each other in their attacks on democratic norms and institutions. They've made really enormous gains in the international system and have been using that influence to promote autocracy as a viable alternative to democracy. And this cooperation isn't based on any unifying ideology or even particular affinity among authoritarians. Rather, it's based on a single shared interest, which is to stay in power by any means necessary. So in the past, developing and transitioning countries might have felt pressured to enact democratic reforms if they wanted to gain support from the wider international community. But today they have the option of things like economic support with fewer conditions attached, or political support at bodies like the UN and so on. I think Russia's invasion of Ukraine is the latest example of this expansion of authoritarianism that has really helped to drive the democratic decline. Just to give a couple other examples of kind of this collaboration from the last year, Chinese and Russian envoys worked to water down the UN Security Council's response to the military coups in Myanmar and Sudan. The Kremlin has continued to prop up Lukashenko's dictatorship in Belarus, which in turn has, of course, provided a launching base for Russian troops invading Ukraine. And of course, collaboration among autocrats isn't new, but what is new is that we're seeing the effects that this collaboration is having on the ground in countries all around the world. So just to look at one example, military coups were more common in 2021 than in any year of the past decade. Last year, Mali had its second coup in 10 months, and already this year, the military has seized control in Burkina Faso. We're also seeing no contest elections intensifying. So in countries from Russia to Nicaragua, authoritarian leaders have dropped even the pretense of competitive elections. They've jailed opposition outright and have congratulated each other on their undemocratic wins. And one of the reasons that I think leaders face fewer deterrents to this anti-democratic behavior is because democracies themselves are weakening. Elected leaders and political parties inside democracies have been targeting core democratic institutions. So one way this is being done is that political actors are attempting to delegitimize the electoral process to stay in power longer. I think the most striking example, of course, last year was in the United States, arguably, when rioters on January 6th attempted to overturn the election results. But another prominent example I'd flag is in Brazil, where President Bolsonaro is up for re-election in October. He's been laying the groundwork to claim fraud if he needs to, and using tactics like casting doubt on the electronic voting machines that will be used in the October vote. Rule of law is another pillar of democracy under threat. So to take Poland, the governing Law and Justice Party has really doggedly manipulated and circumvented the law over the past few years to assert control over the judiciary. Media freedom is under similar attack. For much of 2021, for example, the government in Slovenia withheld legally mandated funds that were intended for the country's public broadcaster. And this continued despite a judicial order to restore the funding. And finally, as we're seeing in India, there is the spread of illiberal leaders who prioritize their voting base over the good of the population as a whole. So when democracies grow weaker internally, it really damages the credibility of the concept of democracy itself. It allows leaders in places like China and Russia to claim that democracy is not, in fact, a system that serves people's interests. And it gives them cover for their own even more egregious abuses. But I'll just kind of conclude on a slightly hopeful note. I don't see this long-term democratic decline as irreversible. People do continue to risk their lives to demand freedom in the most dangerous of settings. So this is happening from Myanmar to Sudan and today in Ukraine. So despite the crackdowns and the pushback, I think the demand for democracy will continue because people have an inherent desire to live freely. So I'll stop there and looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks. Let's get in, Dr. Berman. Amy just shared with us so many examples of like how from places from Brazil to Poland, we are seeing autocracy coming back. Why is it that the political winds are flowing in the same direction in so many places around the world at the same time?
So great question, and thanks for inviting me. Let me try to add a little bit of context to the great summary that Amy has provided us of, sort of the state of democracy in the world today. So if we look back to the end of the 20th century, right, we had this incredible, what social scientists and others have referred to as wave of democracy, right? We had a huge number of countries making transitions to democracy. This wave started in Southern Europe with the collapse of dictatorships in places like Portugal and Spain. It spread to Latin America, collapse of military dictatorships there. And then, of course, perhaps most spectacularly with the collapse of the Soviet Union and communist regimes across, Central Asia, Eastern Europe, yada, yada, yada. Now, the reason the term wave was used, right, was to capture the fact that there were all of these countries moving in a direction towards democracy in this case at the same time. And also, of course, if you know anything about history, there were many previous points in history when similar things happened. In Europe in 1848, we had a huge collapse of dictatorial regimes after the First World War, of course, after the Second World War, when we had transitions to democracy, again, not just in Europe, but across the globe, including obviously in India. Now, the thing about waves, as anyone who's ever been to a beach knows, is that they are inevitably followed by undertows. And so the term wave is used not only to capture that process or that sort of idea of countries moving together, but because there is an inevitable undertow. Now, why is that the case? Why do we use the term waves? Why do we expect from history, right, for there to be undertows? Because it is extremely difficult to make democracy work. We think when we look at folks living in dictatorships that getting rid of dictators is extraordinarily difficult, and it is. But what we also know is that actually getting rid of dictators is only the first step in a very long process. And in fact, in many ways, the easiest, right? Getting rid of dictators seems hard, but in fact, building democracies is even more difficult. And perhaps we'll talk about why that is the case. The other thing that I think we should put in context, right, is that we've sort of forgotten, maybe even more in the West than in India, right, that democracy is relatively new, right? So we've had some version of it, but not complete democracy in the United States, obviously for a very long time. But in Europe, really, democracy only became the norm after the Second World War. And I think what happened over the post-war period, the second half of the 20th century, is that we took it for granted and forgot in the West and perhaps in other places how much it took for it to work well. So I put this in context because what we're seeing now, as Amy said, is indeed a dramatic, sort of undertow, democratic backsliding, autocratization, and that should absolutely sadden us. It should not, however, I think, surprise us when we recognize not only the lessons of history, but more important, the underlying reason for those lessons of history, which is it takes a lot to make democracy work well, even in places like India, the United States, Western Europe, where democracy has been in place for a very long time. If you are not constantly cultivating the institutions, the norms, the social and economic preconditions that make democracy work, it is very easy for it to be undermined relatively quickly. And I think that is what we're seeing in places like India and parts of the West today. And the difficulty of building up those norms and institutions is what we're seeing in places where we were so hopeful in the late 20th and early 21st century. And we have seen so much backsliding and autocratization over the last 10 or 15 years.
Thank you. Let me bring in Mr. Josy Joseph. So apologies for mispronouncing your name earlier. I want to question this. So we talk about democratic waves, and Dr. Berman talked about like how this was inevitable, these kind of flows. But some of the places are like the democracy, as the way we know it, this model has been fairly stable in the West pretty much since the post-World War era, has been fairly stable. And even now, despite the onslaughts, most of those societies remain fairly democratic. But in other parts of the world, whether it's Central Asia or Africa or South America, despite repeated efforts to bring in democracy, these efforts have not really borne much fruit. Is there something inherent in a society that makes it more hospitable to the democratic system, and some societies just inhospitable?
I don't think, that's an argument that a lot of Western academics make. I think that's not the case. I think all societies and all human beings are born to be free and want to be free, but it's just the situations. And as Dr. Sheri just pointed out, once you have autocrats in place, it's very difficult to overthrow them, right? So the challenges of overthrowing democracy by default ends up, the challenge of creating a democracy or overthrowing autocrats makes people in countries like Saudi Arabia, etc., look as if they like undemocratic autocratic lives. That's not a very fair thing to say to begin with. I just wanted to point out a few more things about the debate that we have framed. Actually, it's not the idea of democracy which is under assault. It is the democratic governments in certain societies which are under assault because of a host of factors that have come up. There is no question that democracy is the best form of governance, and there is no alternative. And whatever people might talk about China or Singapore, etc., there are other, there are very serious lacunae and problems with them from a perspective of liberty and freedom. I think one of the things that academics or all of us have not given enough attention to are a few historical contexts, which I just want to throw up here. One is that we are witnessing a losers' revolt after having celebrated, over-celebrated the tyranny of merit over the last decade or so. What we have seen is that for the first time in our in history, the publishing capabilities, publishing and distribution capabilities, media capabilities have been democratized beyond the elite. So you and I can publish today. And if you look at those social media platforms and internet, they have been largely invaded by this losers revolt. So you look at, if I go to my Twitter handle, I can every morning, if I can spend a day, entire day just answering questions from my followers. And I don't know who the followers are. And I know many journalists and writers who waste a lot of time doing that. This losers revolt is what in many ways is created a Trump phenomenon or a Modi phenomenon or several other phenomena around the world. There are other factors, communal, religious, caste, racist, etc. But the losers revolt, empowered by the big tech companies of the world, is something that we haven't paid enough attention to in the way it is destroying the idea of merit, the idea of conversation, the idea of debates, idea of academically rigorous conversations that have always helped us move forward. That's one thing. The second thing that I wanted to add was that one of the things that when Amy and Dr. Sheri spoke was about institutions. There are two kinds of democracies in the world. One are those democracies which, despite facing the losers' revolt and all kinds of challenges, they will definitely survive. And those democracies are the ones which have strengthened and built their democratic institutions, as we know traditionally. And the feeder institutions and the larger network of institutions. For example, in the US, when Trump announces crackdown on immigration, travel of people from certain countries, the protesters who landed up at the airports were not from the Democratic Party. They were largely from organizations like, civil liberties unions. And if you look at the US, the way the mainstream media stepped up to the challenge from Trump is also a celebration of the fact that America is home to a large number of liberal academic institutions and very strong liberal academic values. We don't have it, and the blame should be on, in countries like India. What has happened is the post-independence generation, meaning my parents and my generation, we are both the sinners. We took our eyes off this very precious democracy and the freedom, and we were busy financially securing ourselves. My parents' generation may have been struggling to secure and getting us education. Those of us who got good education, we were celebrating the education in very materialistic ways, buying that big apartment and that big car, and going for family vacations when the thugs from countryside or cities came in and just ran away with your democracy. And that's what precisely happened. I think every generation has to struggle, fight, and sacrifice if you want to remain democratic and to protect individual liberties. Having said all that, I just want to add a little another aspect to the entire debate, which especially to the point of Amy and Freedom House, etc. See, one of the problems that we are facing in this conversation about democracy is that it is very largely and significantly biased from a Western perspective. It is not a global analysis that's happening even now. For example, Freedom House and other indices, they capture a lot of the failures correctly, but they also fail to capture the damage that simplistic global stand on democracy or related issues have on societies like ours. I just want to highlight 2 points what I'm trying to argue. Number one, post 9/11, suddenly America draws up this theory of you're either with us or with the enemy, and everyone with an arm became a terrorist. And across the world, it empowered tyrannical governments, and I think over almost 150 countries passed anti-liberty, very tough laws cracking down on armed insurgencies, and nation states that were not fully formed, and where historically you would actually call popular insurgencies, which may be called freedom fighters in the historic context, suddenly overnight became terrorists. And across the world, I don't want to name the countries, almost everyone copy-pasted the Bush doctrine to strengthen their autocratic tendencies. The other example I wanted to cite was of the post 9/11 and the last 2-3 decades. We have been having this entire fight over controlling illicit flow of money. And one of the outcomes of it are legislations in countries like India, which is targeted at money laundering and financial crime. So India has an act which came up 11 years ago called Prevention of Money Laundering Act, PMLA. Those legislations passed in India or by countries like India to satisfy the Western frameworks and demands have now become this very powerful tool to subvert democracy. So under PMLA, India has seen over 1,500 raids and arrests. Of that, only 9 cases have resulted in any court decisions. Of that, just about 6 have resulted in convictions. So your Western frameworks of controlling money laundering, in good sense, in all good fairness, has now become the most powerful potent legal tool, and the implementing agency, enforcement directorate, the foot soldiers of an autocracy that is almost taking over India. So we need to have far more, and while the Western demands on PMLA were implemented, we did not, and the Western countries did not weigh on the countermeasures. For example, if your PMLA that is being misused in India is being misused against the NGOs, against activists, against media house, etc., why isn't any punitive action against the free flow of your Western investment funds into countries like India? Why has in the United States so-called Foreign Corruption Prevention Act enforcement agencies not looked at the investments by your large tech companies in some of India's most corrupt companies. By any yardstick of FCPA, some of the investments made by America's, some of the most celebrated tech companies in, I don't want to take the names because it can be defamatory and all, in certain Indian firms would not pass FCPA basic due diligence. And there is complete silence. So we need to be sensitive to that reality. We need to globalize the fight for democracy. So in conclusion, I would argue that India as probably the most complex human experiment in socio-political way in the human history in 70,000 years, where so many diverse societies have come together to live together under nation state, under written law. This is a fight which is global. If India goes down as a democracy, its repercussions won't be within its boundaries. It is going to be felt across the world, and its celebrations would mark the end of progress that we see today. So I think the fight for India is beyond the returns for your global funds and the greed of the capital, the flawed capitalist markets. Until we realize that those Western money, those foreign investments are also empowering these autocracies to rise up in terms of secret donations to partnerships in business, etc. I don't think struggle of democracies like ours would succeed in its fullest way. Even if tomorrow you get a Modi goes away, the next autocrat will rise, because that autocrat is going to be fed by those same pipelines of Western cash and West empowered laws. Thank you.
Thank you. Democracy, yeah, the fight for democracy needs to be globalized. I have a lot of questions for you, but we'll come back to that. Let me bring in Dr. Paul. There is one other aspect to it. We've talked about how autocracy, how the autocrats want to stay in power, and that the current strongmen in the various countries want to continue in power, and that is why they are undermining the democratic institutions. But there is the other aspect also, the popularity of strongmen among the people. Do you agree with the view that a lot of people are becoming disillusioned in democracy and they are voting? Like in Brazil, there is a lot of popularity that President Bolsonaro has, or in Philippines, there is the strongman tactics are popular among a lot of the population. So what is leading to this popularity of autocrats among the people, ordinary people?
Thank you for inviting me to this fascinating discussion, and I agree with most of the points raised by the previous speakers, but I think we have to go beyond the agency, as you are pointing out to some extent, to the structural factors that are contributing. That structure is not always the cause of everything, but clearly there are the ill winds, as Larry Diamond calls us, not just confined to one country. So there is some deeper causes happening here. My contention is that, of course, democracy is in decline in the short and medium terms, but democracy is, like Sheri said, it's going through different waves. But in the long run, it's going to be a struggle. Now, what are the structural causes? The structural causes are piling up against democracies, persistence in what we understand. And democracy's persistence will depend a lot on how the liberal international order will shape. And it is heavily tied to globalization, the deepened globalization that occurred since the end of the Cold War. And even before that, since the end of World War II, you had phases of globalization happening. And the liberal order is has contributed enormous amount, very much built around neoliberal ideas of, laissez-faire understanding of market, has contributed to extraordinary class divisions. We know the wealth, the Piketty argument. Beyond that, there's considerable evidence that every year the billionaires are increasing, and India is producing quite a few, as I noticed. And this is creating expectations game. People are feeling unfulfilled expectations. You have freedom to some extent, and there's wealth coming to your country, you see that, but it's not coming to your pocket. It's affecting your well-being dramatically because the current inflation, who is the most suffering from that? The lower middle class and the poor. The upper middle class and the rich are, of course, managing reasonably okay. But the point is, this is creating winners and losers. And we really need to go back to class analysis. We don't need to be Marxist for that, because social classes emerge out of economic structural conditions that and institutions are not helping to resolve these problems created by structural inequalities. So what do people do? They go to their identity markers. That can be race, that can be religion, that can be ethnicity, anything that gives them hope. Often it is based on myths and ideas that they are not often going to work out. So these identity markers sometimes are extremely useful for politicians or leaders with some skills in appealing to these masses. And masses, despite all our good feeling about, are not often educated on many of these things. In fact, liberal education is weakened all over the world. It's, many of the US colleges started off as liberal arts colleges. And there is a contempt for learning liberal ideas. I just talked to the Indian techies in Silicon Valley to wherever. They don't look at political scientists with any favor because they think it's a waste of money. It's simply not needed somehow. And by the way, there was an argument that earlier made, people are born with desire for freedom. Not really. People need to be educated. People need to be trained. People are not liberal initially. You are born into family structures where the hierarchy is more important. And if the hierarchical structure is deeply entrenched, then you have a different set of ideas. And if all your training is in religious schools or other institutions, you're not going to think about freedom as much as you think. So there is a failure of liberal institutions internally and externally to resolve what I call collective action problems. Collective action, whether it is international or domestic. And this American failure is very palpable here. America has been a defender of democracy, did a lot of nasty things to promote in the name of democracy. In fact, mostly were geopolitical reasons. And current interventions, the past interventions simply did not help. Military interventions without an exit strategy and created extraordinary social divisions in places like the Middle East. So then look at the American model, and within America, winners and losers again. And that is going to widen. And America has a pre-existing problem with race, pre-existing problem with the demographic divisions. Everybody who knows that what's going on is the democratic subversion is a result of fear of the so-called white angst, or the fragility, some people call it. And this is a status problem. New York Times had this great article that's combined this feeling of status loss by the upper class, the white class in America. And so that status situation is going to worsen because of the demographic changes, the migration that's taking place. Now, there is a kind of a new Cold War emerging, and rising powers are nationalist. They are trying to use civilizational states idea, and they are trying to attack democratic freedom because the same rights that we cherish will hurt them. If they are there, people will start thinking, questioning their policies, and they really don't want that. And so they use populism as a mechanism to stay in power, and staying in power is the number one objective of, in fact, all politicians, but many democracies have this tradition that staying in power, if you lose it, leave, peacefully transfer power. But for a populist or a semi-authoritarian leader, somehow you have to stay in power. And that would mean appealing to these other values, not necessarily democratic values, is very important. So the economic power is also shifting from liberal states. And I think globalization has really done a kind of boomerang situation here. You have allowed China, into a massive beneficiary of economic globalization. And China has done something great things, which is uplifting millions of people out of poverty. But in that process, the so-called liberal states have lost a lot of their manufacturing industries. And that means their class divisions have increased. But earlier times, the proletariat, the working class, had this ability to form coalitions, labor unions, and became more progressive. But today's working class has no such opportunities. So they rely on these populist ideas, and social media is their main area where they get information. And then the failure of democratic states to produce democratically oriented, prudent leaders. Reckless leadership is coming because politics is a very difficult game. So a lot of smart people, good people don't want to join it. So what you get, a lot of corrupt people, people with money and power, and we know that in India's case, that's happening. And that's the case in most countries, by the way. It's very difficult to be an active politician and survive for a long time without causing harm to yourself, economically and psychologically. So these are, there's performance failure. Definitely the COVID crisis has shown how weak some of these democracies are. And no one understands why the United States has the maximum number of deaths. 1 out of every 20, or every 30, if you put that number 1 million. So we need civic literacy, and that needs education. Start from school curriculum about culture, civilizations, but democracy as an idea. We need democratically oriented leaders. Democracy needs to be taught. And system of democracy is that allow people to think critically. And that is what is missing here. So social media, I agree with Josy that is doing its damage. The corporate world is doing its damage. And we need to think powerfully of what norms need to be taught to our young generation in particular, and how do we change those values over a period of time. But it is both structure and agency. It cannot be just put the blame only on Brazil. We have to think about what's going on globally. And I think there is much more much more to this story than we think.
Thank you, sir. If you allow me just a minute, I want to bring in like a layman question. A lot of the things that have been mentioned so far in this discussion are very similar to the kind of criticisms that I come across in my routine discourse, criticisms of democracy that I come across in my routine discourse. I'll just point out a few that have been mentioned. One has been mentioned about how corporate money and other powerful people, corrupt people, international money can influence democracy just because of the amount of money that's involved in elections. Another one that came up is the identities, that how in a competitive election mode, it is just natural that these leaders will try to mobilize people on the basis of their identity, try to sow divisions, whether it's based off religion or caste or what class. And then ignorance of the voters, that many of the voters aren't just informed enough. They're very susceptible to the misinformation they come across on social media, etc. These are all very common criticisms of the democratic model itself. So should we then start thinking about alternative models? Like, I want to counter what Mr. Joseph said earlier, that democracy is the best form of government and there is no better alternative. Given that it has all these flaws which are inherent to in the way the democratic model is constructed, based on elections, should we be looking at alternative models? Any one of you can answer that, sorry. Please, yes, Ms. Dr. Berman.
So, I mean, obviously we all hear those critiques, and it's true. I mean, democracy can be corrupt. Democracy can give rise to politicians that engage in ethnic outbidding. India is a great example of that. And democracy relies on voters making choices, and voters can often be misinformed. I will say, however, that it's important to think about, what we're talking about comparatively. I mean, I'd like to see someone make an argument that autocracies are better at countering those trends than democracies are. I mean, how many authoritarian regimes are not even more corrupt than democracies? I mean, look at something, that's in the news today. I mean, Putin has embezzled from his own people billions and billions of dollars. And I do not think that if we did, sort of rigorous comparative studies, if such were even possible, because autocracies, of course, do not allow for freedom of the press and free civil society and other kinds of things that would allow us to actually know what was going on. So sure, democracies can be corrupt, but authoritarian regimes have even fewer checks and balances and therefore are even more prone to corruption. The same kind of thing with identity politics. Absolutely. This is something that is plaguing democracies today. My own country, India, and many others, but so many authoritarian regimes rely on deepening communal cleavages, on sort of putting in place leaders who depend precisely on favoring some groups as opposed to others. I mean, look at the wars in places like Syria today, which are based entirely on that, or the tragedies in places like Iraq, my own country's role in creating that tragedy notwithstanding. And as far as sort of the ignorance of voters, sure, we can be saddened by the fact that not everyone who votes in India or the United States has the time to spend on researching issues that we do. But authoritarian regimes depend on voters not being informed. They depend on voters not learning about the issues. They depend on voters not having a choice in choosing their own leaders in government. So everybody should be critical of democracy because that's how democracy gets better. But recognize that these things are much worse in authoritarian regimes, which lack the institutional and other mechanisms for improving them. At the very least in democracy, you have two things, right? One is the potential to change your leaders in governments if they're too corrupt, if they deepen social cleavages, if they try to misinform their populations. And of course, democracy also says that you are entitled to choose your leaders in governments, right? That is a basic human right. And authoritarian regimes do not allow citizens that basic human right. So I think it is wise and important for citizens in democracies to constantly criticize the realities that they face. But I think there's a difference between criticizing the flaws of democracy and imagining that somehow or another those flaws don't exist in authoritarian regimes. They do, they're worse, and citizens don't have the ability to influence them in ways that might make them better. I think we forget that because we're living in a time when democracy's problems are all too clear.
I just want to add to what Dr. Sheri said, Ejur, which is that yes, to democracies like India, there is an alternative which is a better democracy. The fact is that India has been a democracy for last 75 years, but despite the availability of enough data in this country, we have not debated how seriously flawed is the Indian electoral system of first past the post system. So India's so-called popular prime minister gets just about maybe 20% of the national voters support, I mean total population support, and he is seen as this hugely popular guy. And there are large vote banks which go completely underrepresented in the parliament. And data has been there available election after election, year after year. It's we who failed to improve this democracy so that it could be better for the last Indian. I'm sure this case is not very different in most other countries. So I think that instead of debating better other alternatives to democracy, I think the debate should be about how do you make the democracies better. When I say democracy, I would say that it's that concept which allows me to think freely, speak freely, and exercise my rights freely.
So democracy as an institution is like a living thing. It needs nurturing. It cannot be left to the vagaries of social forces beyond a level. So why I agree with the previous discussion that the other models don't offer freedom and prosperity simultaneously. One may give you more wealth, but then humans need more than that. And that's the attraction of democracy. But there are different mechanisms, different forms of democracy. And what we are witnessing is, after a period of time, there is decline in the democratic values, civic culture, democratic institutions. This means nurturing agents. Who are the people who want to do this? Are they active? Are they able to express themselves? The problem with authoritarian models, that expression is gone, which means there is no auto-correction unless the leader, unless Putin decides to change things, others have to do this violently or non-violently. So this non-violent change, improvement, that's the attraction of democracy. But it's not never going to be perfect. And there's expectation that democracy should always do only good things and always be successful. So let's be careful when we say democracies have to be replaced with some other model, because that model we have witnessed past 200-300 years, very few of them have produced both freedom and prosperity. So improving, innovating democracy with, of course, public involvement would be very essential, and that's where civic culture is very needed.
I would just
Yes,
also
indeed.
echo all of my fellow panelists and say, I don't think we should be looking to another system. Democracy is the best system we have, as Dr. Paul mentioned, that can make sure people's rights and freedoms are protected and respected. And just going back to what Sheri mentioned, it's extremely difficult to make democracy work. So this is what we need to focus on, is identifying the flaws and determining how to fix them and to further strengthen our system. And then this in turn makes democracy a kind of a better self-correcting system where you have the checks and balances that can make sure that abuses can be held accountable.
I think I could be wrong on this, but I think a lot of the dip in the popularity of democracy happened during this pandemic period. And one of the reasons attributed to it was that the democratic form of government is not the best adapted to deal with something which is an emergency, whether you're thinking about whether the global pandemic, a response to that, where a lot of democratic checks and balances slow you down. Decisive action is what is needed, or something like climate change, where people tend to commend China's resolve and the way it has moved about tackling climate change, whereas a lot of the other countries is kind of stuck in legislative deadlocks, as well as like a lack of popularity. So just want you to address this criticism. Any of you would want to do that?
Yeah, Jur, I mean, I would strongly urge you to look at real data. China, along with India, is now becoming a great threat to the world facing climate change. At Glasgow, they together scuttled the entire idea about phasing out coal instead of, and they made it into phase down, without disclosing the fact that, for example, Indian Prime Minister's close buddy Adani is becoming one of the world's largest coal producers. So these autocrats are not just a threat to our internal democracies; they are a threat to human population. That keeping that aside, I am saying that if anything COVID showed you, it was that democracy is the best protection for our citizens. If you let autocrats and idiots like what we saw in India to decide to shut down a country overnight, you will have hundreds would be dead, but that's what happened, and millions on the streets, and the economy is crashing out. So India is a great example if we want to argue that a very mature, refined democracy is best placed to deal with a crisis than any other system. Or you will have a madcap like Putin one day sending his tanks to the next city, and that's what's happening. Putin may have sent tanks to Kyiv, but in India, our rulers sent invisible tanks of death and misery to millions of our migrants.
While you're on this, maybe one of you can also talk about like the US, where the civil liberties, the judicial protections have not allowed mandatory vaccination mandates, etc., which has to large extent slowed down the recovery from the pandemic. That could also be perceived as a limitation of a democracy, whereas a dictator could just go ahead and make everybody vaccinated.
Yeah, one of the
yeah. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Amy.
Sorry. Oh, okay. Sorry. Yeah, I think this comes down a lot to one of the kind of core weaknesses of US democracy, which is rising political polarization and kind of improper influence over politics. So this has allowed something that should be treated as just a national health emergency to really be politicized, and makes it much harder to kind of convince people that vaccination is safe and it helps other people around them. So I think looking kind of at the root problems of US democracy is really important when considering this.
Dr. Berman?
Yeah, I mean, this is a sort of touchy topic, but I would question the way that you phrase that. I mean, there's simply no doubt that vaccines are one of the great human inventions, in the sense that they have probably saved more lives in modern times than anything else other than public sanitation. And, you know, that is a fact. But we have to ask ourselves about this question about mandates. I mean, I think taking the vaccine is a no-brainer, right? I mean, the data is clear, COVID is terrible, all those kinds of things. But the question, again, I think that Amy said, of whether this is something that governments should be forcing their citizens to do, I think has some very powerful implications. I think what Amy said is correct, which is that you want to create a society where people trust politicians and experts, and so they do these kinds of things voluntarily. I would not judge government's efficacy with regard to the pandemic using a criteria of whether or not they can force their citizens to get vaccines. I think that is odd and problematic. I would say that thinking about, you know, sort of overall responses to the pandemic are fair. I do not think there's any evidence that democracies performed as a category worse than non-democratic regimes. There are certainly lots of democracies that performed well and a lot of democracies that did not. I would put my own country, obviously, in that latter category. But the same could be said of authoritarian regimes. Here is a place precisely where, you know, sort of as Amy indicated, I think things more like levels of trust are more important than, you know, the type of regime. Countries that had high levels of social trust, which tends to be in more democratic countries, but not exclusively, tended to do, you know, as far as analyses that I've seen, somewhat better, precisely because you could get citizens to comply with some common sense kinds of things, whether it was before vaccines, some social distancing and masking in certain situations, and then taking vaccines once they were available. But I would also suggest that looking at a place like China as an example strikes me as completely odd, even if we put aside the question of, you know, even if we put aside the fact that the pandemic started there for reasons that I do not think can be separated from the fact that it is indeed an authoritarian system. The way that the country responded is you know, I think from a broader comparative perspective, odd. Sure, deaths have been very low in China, which is obviously important, but the cost has been extremely high. And now China faces a very weird situation where their population is not vaccinated. It does not have natural immunity. And for political reasons, the government has not wanted to use non-Chinese vaccines. The vaccines that they do have are not as efficacious as those of other places. And so you have a population now that, you know, is in a very odd situation as far as interacting with the rest of the globe, which may in fact be precisely what the Chinese government prefers.
So I think the problem is the crisis management capacity of states, or the capacity of states as a whole. And there, what you are witnessing is democracies are slow to take action, most of them, including India, as we witnessed. But without the democratic elements, freedom of the press, information available, data collection, etc., the responses would have been worse. So Amartya Sen's famous study about famines comparing India and China, showing that it was the absence of freedom of press that really stopped China, or really caused so many millions dead during Mao's time in particular. But democracy also has a better chance of rebuilding if there are democratic elements present, which means bureaucracy has to be brought into to accountability. And I think this is the problem where people simply assume that a dictator can simply force people to take a vaccine. And then what? Does that mean if the dictator is benevolent, probably some success, but in the long run, building that society needs societal support, trust, all those values we think about in a democratic society, and understanding how development is undertaken. And that's where the dictators can fail, because dictators don't get the support of the people, or they will rely on crony capitalists to some extent, and they don't bring the public goods that are needed. So democracy has disadvantages in the short-run management of huge crises that are unanticipated. But in the long run, democracy can rectify because of its system of governance and institutions, if they work properly.
Thank you. I want to come back to India. Something Amy had said at the beginning, that democracy is more than just elections. A very common view in India is that how can India be going down in democracy when the voter turnouts remain very strong and the current government is the outcome of the majority of the people through the electoral process voting this government in. So their actions are already backed by the voting act of the people. Like, we have given them the authority to act on our behalf. So how is that? So I want you to, so basically what I'm trying to understand is that in what ways do we think that democracy is getting, is declining in India? Why is India treated as, just a little bit more elaboration on that. Why is India downgraded in democratic rankings? Not just in by Freedom House, but like, I think there are many, many international reports that have downgraded India democracy. I don't know, maybe can we start with Dr. Paul?
I think the Freedom House people can tell you better than I can.
Okay.
Well, the number of elements, it has been a secular trend over 75 years. The founding fathers were amazingly democratic. Jawaharlal Nehru, despite all the bad things people talk about him, was fundamentally a liberal Democrat. He would go to the parliament, listen to the crappy speeches by some of the people. He treated parliament very as an important institution. Dr. Ambedkar, founder of the Constitution, was highly democratic and liberal in his values, of course, much more than many of the other people because of his fight against casteism, etc. So you have these founding fathers with this enormous capacity and understanding, bred in the Western liberal modernity that they experienced in Europe and other places. But they are not abandoning the Indian values. India also contributed to modernity, and they were trying to bring together into the sort of a secular democratic framework. But their expectations did not work because over time, the economic forces, the performance of Indian democracy has not been that great in solving the enormous poverty and other issues, because it started off from such a very weak base. And so expectations, rising expectations, but not fulfilling. And then people are relying on these other markers I mentioned. Electoral politics became very entangled to your caste, your community, and your religious system. But I would say without democracy, India would have fallen apart. Because democracy, however flawed it is, gives some amount of power to the local guy, to the local religious groups, ethnic groups. A Muslim, I come from the state of Kerala, I believe Josy too, where a Muslim can participate and go to Trivandrum, the state capital, in the legislature. He has representation. Same in Delhi, there's a representation. And that wouldn't be achieved if there is no democratic system, because then it will be bureaucratic telling you how these communities should. But that also generates all kinds of challenges to democracy, because dysfunctionality comes in, performance indicators don't improve. So there is that decline. I think democratic leaders, the commitment of leaders declined over time. But I place a lot of blame on Indian bureaucracy. Okay, the political class is not the only one here, the problem. The Indian bureaucracy, unfortunately, is not developmental. It is hierarchical. It is built around the British ideas. And until they are the ones bringing urban planning, they're the ones developing all the things that we really need to see, distribution included. And so the bureaucracy is not globalized as far as I see it. There's a lot of corruption among them. Politician, of course, there's corruption. So people's expectations are going in different ways. But Indian democracy is not a total failure. I must say that without democracy, India would still go through tumultuous internal violence and conflict, including religious communal violence. And democracy is achieved in pacifying, integrating many parts of India. And that is what we should aim for, and how to improve those democratic credentials over a period of time. I don't
That's going
think...
to be my next question. Let me just go with what you just said. Leaders have declined over time. And you yourself said Nehru and Ambedkar were bred in Western liberal modernity. But isn't the democratic system supposed to have people who represent the society? They were clearly not the representatives of the average Indian society at the time. But let me bring in Mr. Joseph. You said now social media has given everybody a voice. Everybody has access to get their views out. Would it be fair to say that the leaders that India is producing now are truly the representatives of the society? So if anything, the democracy is working as it was designed?
No, not at all. I mean, the leaders that we're producing today are actually examples of the failures of India's democracy, because what we call the checks and balances of democratic system should exist from the local police station up to the parliament, through judiciary, independent media, etc., etc. And honestly, between all of us, we know that if those checks and balances had flourished in this country, some of our most celebrated leaders today would be in jail for murders, kidnapping, and other very serious criminal charges. It's as clear as daylight. But because our institutions were not strengthened, because the democracy is weak, these people found their way through the loopholes. So we are the leaders who are coming up, are not only are they escaping a weak checks and balance system of democracy, they are also people who are capable of mobilizing resources beyond your imagination. Today, Indian democracy, Indian political system is a bigger black money operation than the biggest drug mafia operations that the world has ever seen. And probably the world's largest black money operations are Indian political parties. And of that, the ruling party is far ahead of the rest. Can you imagine a system called electoral bonds, where donors can anonymously give money? I don't know how many American corporations have donated to it. So people who have the capacity, I'm not talking just about BJP, next maybe the Congress, people who have the capacity to organize enormous amounts of black money, people who can come through the slips of the cleavages or the failures of the checks and balance system, are now hijacking democracy. They are not winners of the democracy. They are not leaders of front of. And in fact, I've been working on my next book, which is set in 1947 period. And as Dr. Paul was saying, if you read those leaders, they were schooled in the greatest of the Western or democratic values, but they were not alien. They were very Indian. They were very Gandhian. They were very popular. They were very much Indian, who celebrated the Indian culture. And I think we failed to educate masses, as both Dr. Paul and Dr. Sheri were trying to say. We failed to educate the masses, meaning our generation, the previous generation, about how complex a system those leaders created. When you read their speeches, when you see their debates and differences of those days, I get the sense that it was a collection of geniuses who unusually came together in a very rare moment of history in India. Because when you listen to today's leaders, it sounds like the kind of language I hear on the streets of Mumbai or Delhi, the crass, abusive communal language. There is nothing democratic about it. Democracy fails when that unwritten, undrawn boundaries of morality collapses, not just when you violate the constitution.
Let me bring in Amy. I know she has to leave. So I mean, the democratic system based on elections is inherently susceptible to influence from corporate money, international money, what can be done to reduce that? Because right now, the way a lot of people think is that in a democratic system, the super rich keep getting richer and richer, and the poor keep falling down the ladder. So, and that's one of the reasons, I think we've already discussed, that's attributed to the sort of growing disillusionment of democracy. So how can that be addressed? What could be the solution?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm not sure there's one single answer, so I'd be interested to hear what others think. But I think one way to kind of address this is to make sure that there are laws that guard against improper influence over government officials. Many democracies might already have that, but there might be loopholes or a lack of enforcement or a lack of funding to enforce it. So making sure that those can be strengthened, I think, is really important. I also think there should be serious structural reforms just to the international banking system. This can help to address the problem of corruption and kleptocracy that allow many kind of anti-democratic leaders to remain in power or exert influence. And democratic countries, of course, have often enabled this or even been complicit in abuses of this system. So some things that can be done is addressing the problem of offshore tax havens and closing legal loopholes that can allow people to launder assets in democracies by hiding behind shell corporations. And I think there's also a role that the private sector needs to play, really assessing the impact that their operations and their products can have, and committing to how those might be affecting people's rights and minimizing the harm that might entail.
I think in the crypto age, the checking on international money flows is going to get harder instead of getting easier. I think it's going to become even more easy to send money.
So can I answer that question? Because I think it should be understood that democracies faced this problem before. The European states that came out of World War II, they started the welfare state precisely to address this problem. They knew that if they didn't have the welfare state, the democracies would have fallen apart, because Europe had this enormous class divisions and difficulties after World War II. Even in the United States, it's Roosevelt, then it is Johnson's ideas. You know, the liberals are really done that, helping smoothen the issues that face as a result of the war and the distribution problem. So what the democracies have abandoned is the welfare state. As a result of the Reagan-Thatcher era neoliberal ideas that have brought GDP growth, and that has been taken over the Washington Consensus by much of the world, and that is now being challenged. We know really this is a time for reinventing the welfare state in a different fashion. Of course, it can't be the same as it used to be, but obviously the idea of taxation capacity of the state is very critical. Here, by the way, the autocratic states are also showing billionaires amassing a lot more than you think, because we don't have the full data either. Democracies may offer a bit more data. China may have done in removing poverty to a great extent, but China is also, I believe, it is number 3 in number of billionaires coming out. India is number 2 or something in the world every year now. And so this is not just a democratic problem alone. It's a problem of a capacity of a state to tax, to distribute that wealth, and also to create some foundational ideas of distribution. And that is what is missing today. And that is not a pure democratic problem. It is a global problem as far as I see.
Dr. Berman, I would like to get your views on how the democratic system, how the democratic model can be improved to make it more resilient and more attractive to people.
So let me begin by just finishing or continuing some of the thoughts that Dr. Paul put forward. I think that, you know, one of the things that is really important to recognize, particularly in places like India and the United States, where communal divisions have become even more prominent over the last years is that it's much easier to kind of whip these kinds of identities, these kinds of resentments, and these kinds of divisions up at times when, again, people are sort of suffering, they're worried, they're fearful about the future. And as Dr. Paul said, that is precisely why, sort of welfare states became such a prominent part of the West European post-war model. It was understood that if you wanted to keep people believing in the legitimacy of democracy, believing that their leaders and governments were responsive to them, then these leaders and governments had to work to prevent precisely the kinds of suffering that had been caused by, unregulated capitalism during the pre-war period. So I think that is very important to recognize. And the larger point, right, which is that it's much easier to get people to kind of fall into these ethnic, religious, linguistic identities precisely when they feel that their existing governments and leaders are not responsive to them. So I think that is something that is sort of a general problem across the world today, and especially as we can see in the two largest democracies in the world, the United States and India. But I want to get back to the question that you asked initially about, people who say to you, well, look, why would you downgrade India's democracy? Why would you call it partially free? We have elections. First of all, I think it's important for folks to recognize, and I don't think this is entirely obvious to people who do not have the luxury of studying these things like we do, that, first of all, elections have to be what social scientists call free and fair. Right? It's not simply enough that people get to go to the ballot box. That's important. But what does that mean? It means that the press really needs to be free. That is to say, citizens have to be able to get diverse sources of information. It means the opposition has to not be manipulated, oppressed, bought off. It means that civil society groups have to be free to organize so that they can bring people into the political sphere so that they can facilitate collective action. It means that the judiciary must be entirely independent so that if governments or leaders are doing things that are against the rule of law, that they will be held accountable. And the problem in places like India, Turkey, Hungary, which also fall into this category, is sure, people do get to go to the polls, and that is important, but those elections are no longer considered to be free and fair because all of the things that make those choices meaningful at the polls have been degraded to a very significant extent. And I think people who see democracy simply as, we get a chance to participate in elections every several years, don't recognize that for those choices to be meaningful, a whole variety of other things need to be in place. And they don't see those things degrading as clearly as they would if they were all of a sudden not allowed to vote. So these are the kinds of things that, as several of my colleagues have pointed out, citizens, perhaps because, again, we've fallen down a little bit on civic education because we haven't done a good job of explaining to folks who don't have as much time as us to study these things what it really takes to make elections meaningful, what it really takes to make democracy work, and that they should be every bit as concerned with freedom of the press, free civil society, freedom of speech, as they should be with whether or not they get to vote every, whatever it is, 3, 4, or, however many years each particular country's electoral cycle is.
And do you also want, while you're in this, do you also want to address what's the solution? What would you suggest?
So that's a big question and a tough one to end at, because if I could summarize in 5 minutes what it takes to make democracy work, I'd be a lot more famous than I am right now. I would say that, look,
let me make it easier. Let me just make it simplified. What would be your top one? I know there can be many, many different ways. What would be the top solution that you would recommend?
So I think it depends very much on the country, because the problems facing democracy differ from country to country. In my own country, right, because I'm not an expert on India as some of the folks on this panel are. In my own country, right, we still have a relatively vibrant civil society. We still have a very vibrant press. And so I think a lot of some of our problems could in fact be helped by some institutional reforms to protect the integrity of elections, to improve, as Dr. Joseph said, actually the way voting occurs. I think that, you know, sort of ranked choice voting and other things that might help actual majorities be constructed, that might bring politicians back from extremes towards more moderate positions, could have a significant impact on improving you know, sort of the vibrancy and the health of democracy in the United States in places where institutions have become more degraded, where civil society is less vibrant, where freedom of the press has been undermined further. I would suggest other kinds of things, but in the United States, I think some institutional reforms might make some significant difference.
Thank you. Amy, do you want to share your final remarks on the solutions you propose?
Sure. As I said, I don't think there's any one solution, and I really agree with Dr. Berman that it depends on the country specifically. They all have different strengths and weaknesses. But I would say I think the definition of democracy has really become muddled. A lot of people don't have a very clear understanding of what it actually means, which is this kind of self-correcting system that's made up of different pillars and institutions like judicial independence, media freedom, a strong civil society that can hold leaders accountable and help voters make informed choices and participate in the political process. So I think making sure that that kind of definition can get across and educating people on that would be really important, and that can help them understand why democracy is the best system that we have and why it's the best way to ensure their rights are respected and that they can kind of pursue the life that they want. And one other thing I would just say is I don't think democracy can be imposed from any external force or any external country. It really needs to draw on the expertise of the people within the country who are already trying to push for democracy, and proponents should be supporting those people. And there's a lot of lessons.
I think that's a very valid. Thank you. That's a very valid. Let me bring in Mr. Sorry. Joseph. Amy said it cannot come from outside, and that's actually interesting because there have been incidents when Mr. Obama tried to remind the Indian government about its democratic values, and then more recently Kamala Harris also tried to do that. It actually, I think, backfired, at least in the social media and stuff. It was not taken very positively in India to be lectured by outsiders on democracy. So I would like to get your view on, like, especially for India's case, what do you think? Do you think these are just waves and it's just going to take time and automatically it'll autocorrect, or there can be something that can be done by the civil society?
No, first thing to do is to shut down all the social media companies, because what you just said, that there was a lot of protest in India when Obama said or somebody spoke for better democracy, is because you and I are listening to the echo chambers of Twitter and Facebook, where people have captured it with idiotic information. So I think America, if you can please shut down all of them, half our democracy's problems will be solved. But on a serious note, I just want to go back to what Mr. Professor Paul and others have been saying. I think, and I don't want to waste anybody's time, but having been a part of a boarding school, exposed to extremely liberal, democratic, egalitarian education, I think, and the outcome of that, because I see a vast majority of my classmates, schoolmates being very democratic, a very unusual cohort in a country like India. I think we need to stress as much, and there is no way to put this, to educate young children about democracy, helping them celebrate their freedom and be aware of it, like making, our little girls and boys aware of their basic body and arm and hand, their face and their eyes. I think that is the intervention that is required, because our education system is churning out idiots who think that your adolescence is to be celebrated on Instagrams, and who don't seem to understand the power of democracy and what it's doing for them.
Can I?
Yeah, we will conclude with you, Dr. Paul. I just wanted to bring in a quick remark. So Amy also said that people think that if you've just gone through elections, that's fine. This is the democratic government, and that's the view I see a lot in India. That once the government is elected, it has the right to do whatever it wants. I think the other pillars of the democracy are not appreciated enough, which were designed to keep even the elected government accountable, and that's not. People tend to support the government over protesters because they think the protesters are and destabilizing or are creating nuisance for a government elected by the majority, which just is doing their job. I think as a society, I don't think we appreciate the role of protesting civilians enough. And it's like both of you have said, like it's important for people to have better civic education. Just wanted to emphasize that. Yes, Dr. Paul, we'd love to conclude with you.
Yeah, so I actually agree with that. I think it's a top-down and bottom-up problem here. Let me start with the top-down. The politicians need to be educated. The politician is not democratically oriented, liberal oriented. How can he or she implement the rules that they are supposed to follow? So the democratic norm is something they have to internalize, and then they have to behave accordingly. That also requires institutional reforms. And educating the politician, when I say that, in India, for instance, the MPs come to parliament every 5 years or whatever. Are they getting a proper education on parliamentary rules? Of course, they have some courses, I know, but that's not enough. It's about rules and regulations. But why are you there to begin with? What's your fundamental role and duty? And how do you become a proper democratic representative? That's one. The second is this bottom-up. Civic culture has to be taught. And when I say civic culture, it is not just simply based on one's own national experience. And we need to become global in that. Internationalism has to come in. And I see that even in the Western countries, the history books are so narrowly focused. The Americans rarely teach history of anybody else, as far as I know. I mean, with the two representatives here can teach us. In Canada, my daughter studied Quebec history, basically, because they want to emphasize they are the victims of everything. The world history, as we know, Indian history and all, until you go to the college, which is a tiny minority who ends up taking these classes. So we are lacking this global civic understanding. We are lacking historical understanding. And the Chinese, as far as I know, teach no Indian history. India probably does a little bit more, or sanitized versions increasingly. And how do you make a better citizen, a global citizen? And one of the fundamentals of democratic culture is a globally oriented, internationally oriented, cosmopolitan individual, not this narrow, ethnically oriented individual. So I think it's a long way to go, but this can be done. I mean, we have some examples. I mean, the work these two ladies are doing, our scholars here, it's impressive. Look at their web pages, the two journals and the publications they carry. That has to be spread all around the world. And the ideas that come out of it, easy to read format, and educating people that you have this virtue of this greatest achievement in the past 100 years or less. Humans lived under extraordinary lack of freedom over the millennia. We have come a long way. We are talking to different people, different institutions we are working because of democracy and the values that allowed us to do that. So I think once people realize that, to protect that becomes your individual and collective responsibility.
Thank you. That was a very enlightening session. I think we've come to the close of our session, but I'd like to thank all the panelists for joining us and for being at Argumentative Indians. I hope to have you with us again in future. It's been an honor. And to everyone watching this, I'd like to remind you that if you are interested in more engaging and interesting and informative sessions like this, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thank you. Namaskar.
Thank you.